Good evening. My name is Dale Whitehead, and I'd like to speak to you for a few minutes this evening about sensible gun control in America. My purpose this evening is to encourage you to consider what our nation's policy should be regarding gun control. I am no stranger to guns and their use, both appropriate and inappropriate. I was raised in an agricultural environment where we relied upon guns to rid ourselves of the pestilence of woodchucks. As an adult, I have worked with guns both in an official capacity as a fire investigator and privately as an inventor. At one time, I held 2 provisional patents on a revolutionary bullet design. On the other end of the spectrum, I have seen guns used improperly, including hostage-taking situations and domestic violence situations, both involving guns. I do not speak to you as a political activist or an unrealistic idealist or a Second Amendment supporting extremist. I speak to you as an American citizen that is equally concerned about preserving the individual's right to gun ownership and keeping guns out of the hands of those who are emotionally, mentally, and socially unfit to be allowed to be in possession of a firearm. Guns have a legitimate role in our society. The fact that wildlife management and all of the states rely heavily upon hunters to help maintain the balance between wildlife populations and human habitation is incontrovertible. Just as incontrovertible is the role that guns play in legitimate instances of self-defense. In addition, the shooting sports are enjoyed by a vast number of Americans and are even an Olympic event. The problem that exists is that this issue of sensible gun control has been handled carelessly and callously by both the Second Amendment extremist and the idealistic extremist, and is only portrayed to the public by being filtered through the media outlets, some of which choose to serve as propaganda platforms for one side or the other of the debate. On the one side of the problem, we have the Second Amendment extremists who act as though they feel they have a right to strap an AK-47 around their neck and prance down Main Street just looking for someone to offend them, which in their mind gives them the inalienable right to shoot that person dead. This attitude has given us several examples of its consequences. In April and December of 2016, 2 former NFL players were shot to death in separate road rage instances. In December of 16 and August of 2017, 2 small children were shot to death in separate road rage instances where the shooter missed the driver and hit the child. A 4-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl died. All 4 of those shooters were nothing more than murderers hiding behind the Second Amendment and considering it to be an authorization to kill. On the other side of the problem, we have the idealistic extremist who feel that if gun ownership were to be disallowed, there would be no school shootings, and who, true to form, fail to think their position through to the logical conclusion. For example, when I was in Florida in the fall of 1986, the State Wildlife Commission determined that the water level in the Everglades had risen to the extent that the exposed land masses within the Everglades were insufficient to support the deer population. In an effort to reduce the deer population to a sustainable level, they authorized a special hunting season for the one weekend. On the Friday night before the hunt, the idealistic extremist obtained a court injunction against the hunt, under the guise of protecting the deer. What was not widely reported is what happened the following spring. Because the deer population was not thinned out, and the vegetation was not sufficient to maintain the population, deer starved to death by the thousands. Those that survived were in the process of starving to death, with their ribs showing as they stood hunched back in their final days. The fawns born that spring were undersized, unhealthy, and themselves died by the thousands. This doesn't have anything to do with gun violence. But the point here is that the idealistic extremists afford themselves the luxury of ignoring the consequences of their philosophies, whether it be wildlife management or gun control. It is not my intention to disparage any group. I only point out the aforementioned to demonstrate the absurdity to continue to allow a matter as important as sensible gun control to be handled carelessly and callously by the extremist in the Second Amendment group and the extremist in the idealistic group. It is time that reasonable men and women worked with their legislators and congresspersons to devise legislation that accomplishes two objectives. First, to protect the right of private gun ownership. And second, a means of determining who should and who should not be allowed to be in possession of a firearm, based upon reasonable criteria, such as disciplinary action having been taken against them by their school, the number and types of offenses on their driving record, any record of domestic violence or other aggressive behavior, or any crimes against persons. This is a difficult objective and rife with opportunities for abuse and inequities, but it would not be the only legislation rife with opportunities for abuse and inequities. And the objective is important enough to make an attempt to achieve it. In conclusion, I leave you with this one thought. It is time for reasonable citizens to implement reasonable gun control measures before we wake up someday to find that the extremist in either group, the Second Amendment extremist or the idealistic extremist, have initiated legislation that reasonable adults would find unconscionable, unconstitutional, abhorrent, unfair, and inequitable. For good people to do nothing is to allow others to control their destiny. It is time for this matter to be addressed by reasonable men and women from both the Second Amendment group and the idealistic group, without being unduly influenced by the extremist from either group. Our freedoms and our safety and those of our children are at stake. Thank you.